Today on the Everything 80s podcast, was Perfect Strangers the perfect 1980s sitcom?
Sometimes the world looks perfect, nothing to rearrange. Sometimes you just get a feeling like you need some kind of change. No matter odds are this time, nothing's gonna stand in my way. This flame in my heart, like a long lost friend, gives every dark street a light at the end. Standing tall on the wings of my dream, rise and fall on the wings of my dream. The rain and thunder, the wind and haze, I'm bound for better days. It's my life, my dream, and nothing's gonna stop me now.
It came out around the middle of the decade, but would be a driving force behind the success of many other shows. Perfect Strangers was a sitcom that aired from 1986 to 1992. It featured cousins Larry and Balki living and working in Chicago. It would be a ratings hit, become part of ABC's TGIF lineup, and lead to the spin-off series of Family Matters. And we're looking at Perfect Strangers here today, one of my favorite shows of all time, possibly yours too. So before we get to that, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. I should be there. Here we go. So, as I said, one of my favorite shows, Perfect Strangers, was required viewing in my house. It's not a kid's show per se, but it could still be watched by younger people. And, you know, it may have had sort of slightly inappropriate stuff, but it was still accessible to everyone. It made for the perfect family viewing experience, and it never took itself too seriously. Perfect Strangers had the ideal premise. It had a great duo, had an iconic 80s character in Balki Bartakamoose. It also ran for longer than you probably realized and helped set the stage for the famous TGIF Friday night lineup. So let's look at the premise of Perfect Strangers. And it's kind of considered, now looking back on it, it's kind of like considered Borat light. You know, it's the simple premise of fish out of water, foreigner in a strange land, with the character of Balki Bartakamoose. Fun fact, there was a Yakov Smirnoff show that came out in around the same time. It was sort of trying to capture this same premise that never really worked out. I'll cover that more in another episode. But it also combines elements of the classic odd couple trope of, you know, these two characters thrust together while having, you know, the show based in an apartment. Nothing super original. It's taking a lot of things that had worked before, but kind of, you know, a little bit of a different spin on it. So Balki has left his Mediterranean country of Mypos and is moving to America. He has a distant cousin named Larry Appleton, who is also making a move of his own from Wisconsin to Chicago. Larry is finally living on his own after growing up with a very large family. He's finally enjoying his own space when his distant cousin shows up at his apartment. The early years of the show centered around Balki being completely unfamiliar with American culture, and this always works well. It always has. You know, again, that fish out of water premise. Not that it's necessarily been done to death, but they go to it so often because it works. You know, it's just seeing him trying to familiarize himself with all the new customs and all that, and it always works. He was, you know, a simple sheep farmer from Mypos, and he's trying to navigate his way in the strange new land. He's got his famous Dance of Joy that would be debuted in the second episode of the first season. They had a lot of the character established pretty quickly. The premise also involves the fact that Larry works as a photographer for the Chronicle, and he's obviously apprehensive about Balki living with him. He decides that it's best for Balki to stay and that he should take him under his wing to help him learn all about the new American culture. From there, it then, you know, really quickly moves into the classic buddy sitcom, as Larry is just as incompetent as Balki, and it gets them stuck in many situations with Balki being the one who ultimately gets them out of it. And again, used forever, all the way up into the like a lot of what you've seen on Friends has been borrowed, from all these old style sitcoms. And Perfect Strangers really, I think I'd say, perfected that formula. So let's look at the cast of the show. So Larry Appleton would be played by Mark Lynn Baker. He did a lot of work on Broadway and also appeared in a lot of other classic 80s shows. He was on Full House. He's on Family Matters. He was on Step by Step. He was in Miami Vice. He was even on Sesame Street. Balki Bartokomous was played by the great Bronson Pinchot. So he appeared, if you know your 80s movies, he was in Risky Business, and then he was in Beverly Hills Cop. And Beverly Hills Cop was the one that helped get him the role for Perfect Strangers. He's done a ton of TV work. He also ended up getting the main part on Step by Step. But when Bronson was first offered the role of Balki, he turned it down as he was already committed to another show where he was going to play a gay attorney. And this was going to be a pretty groundbreaking new series. The show was called Sarah, but it got canceled really quickly, and it made him available to do Perfect Strangers. So another of the reasons he turned it down, and this is a weird sort of collaboration of Hollywood meets television, is that Tom Cruise, of all people, said that he shouldn't do a sitcom. This obviously came about when the two were filming Risky Business, and Pinchot told US Magazine that Cruise even offered him money in order for him to avoid having to do television. It's like in the 80s, even going to the 90s, and I guess a little of this still exists today, but there was this massive division between film and TV, and you weren't seen as a serious actor or performer if you did television. And I guess there was this snobbery of only movie actors, and how would you sink so low to do television? Of course, it's completely all turned around, where television is like the holy grail of where real actors and performers go. And then, we've gotten this resurgence in, what they call, say, the golden age of TV, when you had shows like Mad Men and Breaking Bad and The Walking Dead and all these amazing things that existed at the same time. And it continues now. So actors are probably like more shying away from movies and looking for a new Netflix series, or they want to be on HBO Max or with Apple. They know there's a better chance to be seen because, fewer and fewer people are going to movies, or they're only going to see big budget movies. It's just a way to have more of a continued legacy. There's a really good episode of 30 Rock where Jack, they sort of poke light at this whole issue of how no one would ever do television, and the referencing Alec Baldwin making the decision, from being a serious film actor to going to do a sitcom. It's a really good episode. And, people are always like, Alec Baldwin will never do a TV series, but it's basically, with TV, it's like a 9-to-5 job, and a lot of actors like that stability. So interesting side note that Tom Cruise would sort of insert himself in this whole ordeal and try and talk this guy out of playing, one of the most classic, beloved sitcom characters of all time. Here are a few of the other main cast members of Perfect Strangers. So you had Melanie Wilson played Jennifer Lyons, that's Larry's girlfriend. She was also on Family Matters, Step by Step, also on the A-Team. Rebecca Arthur played Marianne Spencer, that was Balki's girlfriend. Belita Moreno played Edwin Twincachetti. She's been on The Golden Girls, Family Ties, Melrose Place. You know her as George Lopez's mother on The George Lopez Show. Ernie Sabella played Donald. He was Leon Carosi on Saved by the Bell. You probably know him better as Pumbaa in The Lion King. Lisa Cutter played Susan Campbell. She's in a lot of other 80s classics like Matlock, MacGyver, 21 Jump Street, Jake and the Fat Man, Murder, She Wrote. And Sam Anderson played Sam Gorpley. Also in a lot of classics like T.J. Hooker, Hill Street Blues, The Golden Girls, Growing Pains, was also in Forrest Gump. So let's look at putting together Perfect Strangers. So you probably remember the name from the credits, but Perfect Strangers was produced by Miller Boyett Productions along with Lorimar Television. The concept of the whole thing seems to come about, honestly, from the 1984 Summer Olympics. We'll get that whole fish out of water thing again. Dale McCraven, who helped create Mork and Mindy, put this show together with Tom Miller and Robert Boyett of Miller Boyett Productions. Miller claims that he noticed a real rise in patriotism after the Summer Olympics of 1984, which were held in Los Angeles. This got him thinking about an immigrant who would arrive in America and try to embrace the patriotism and culture that was happening at the time. So the concept seems pretty decent, but it would be turned down by pretty much every network, including ABC, CBS, NBC. In the 80s, there were really only 3 networks. Those networks were everything. So if you didn't get on board with them, you're pretty screwed. What are you going to do? Go to Netflix? You're 30 years too early for that sort of thing. So you really had to stand out to even get considered a shot at even a pilot back in those days. Miller and Boyett didn't care, as they knew they had a good idea on their hands. We would see this as well. Like I said, this has been done a million times. Crocodile Dundee is another great example of that. Fish out of water, person coming to America and not knowing his new surroundings and everything. So they know they have their good idea, and now Bronson Pinchot is available, and that he was sort of the key to this whole thing. Once they got him on board, they had to scramble to put together a pilot. And I never knew this, but Marklin Baker was never the first choice to play Larry. They had already gone with Louis Anderson. I don't know how that would have worked personally. ABC somehow was now on board. So they would start with just 6 episodes, and they would be released mid-season. This would help it avoid getting lost with all the other new shows premiering earlier in the year. If you're, depending on how old you are, you remember what a big deal the new television season was, where you'd see all these new shows and you'd have to wait for them, as opposed to now where everything is just sort of dumped on you all at once. The other crazy thing was, due to this unorthodox release, they had to get the shows out in record time. Just 3 weeks after shooting their first scene, Perfect Strangers would be on TV. They then had to have shows done in as little as a week to get them out on time, which is a really quick turnaround, even for a sitcom. With the Rush pilot done, they realized Anderson wasn't cutting it as the cousin. Like, keep in mind, they've been filming this whole thing without Marklin Baker. This is all Louis Anderson. Sort of the same way they shot a majority of Back to the Future with Eric Stoltz before bringing Marty McFly on. So they had to make some big decisions. So not only was ABC on board, but they were also offering them this amazingly good time slot on Tuesday nights between big time shows, Who's the Boss and Moonlighting. You can't ask for a better time slot at the time. I'm not sure what changed their mind, or what made them change their mind on this whole thing, but now the show had to really spring into action. Louis Anderson wasn't working. They started putting some things together. They decided on the name Perfect Strangers for the show. That was going to work. And now they're scrambling to find a new cousin, Larry. They had seen Lynn Baker on Moonlighting, and his instant chemistry with Pinchot sealed the deal. So now the show is ready. Like I said, they're turning this out at like rapid pace. If they don't have these things done, they're screwed. And now they release Perfect Strangers to the world. Again, I'm not sure how old you are, or if this was a popular show to you, or if this is the first time you're hearing it, but Perfect Strangers was like required viewing when it came out. It was an immediate sort of sense you had to watch this show. It came out to great ratings because of this, immediately great ratings. And it was an easy show to get into. And that's another absolute necessity for sitcoms in the 80s. They need a very low barrier to entry. They need instantly identifiable characters. And then having a laugh track never hurt either. So you know exactly where you're supposed to be laughing. That's the whole idea with a sitcom, is they don't tend to follow long sort of character arcs and seasonal arcs. You know, they eventually do when they build an audience, but the idea is you should be able to jump in on any episode and know exactly what's going on. You don't necessarily have to know much of the backstory. Perfect Strangers first debuted on March 25th, 1986. This is a tough time to make a dent in the ratings, but Perfect Strangers was still able to do so. It started with just the 6 episodes, as I mentioned, and 5 of them made it into the top 10 highest rated shows. That's how successful it was. A big help to this is the time slot. That was so key in 80s and 90s television, what they call it, like the lead in, and that can determine a lot of success of a show. I mean, the show has to stand up on its own, but the time slot definitely helped. And I think a big appeal for this whole thing and the immediate attachment to the show was the character of Balki. At least it was in my house anyway. He was a classic comedic outcast, which always resonates with audiences, especially families and kids. And it's a bit of some physical comedy, which always works well. Lovable, goofy. It was all there immediately. So the first season, though, is pretty basic. Larry and Balki are working in a discount store that is beneath their apartment, if you remember back to what Perfect Strangers first started out as. Their boss is also their landlord, and they have an upstairs neighbor named Susan. In season 2, they now had 22 episodes and a new time slot. Due to the success of those first 6 episodes, Perfect Strangers was now on at 8 p.m. on Wednesday nights, right before Head of the Class, like the ultimate in prime time. This season sees Susan being phased out and a love interest for Larry brought in, and that is Jennifer. Balki also begins to date his girlfriend, Mary Ann Spencer. And the show goes through some changes and evolutions, and, as all sitcoms do. Going into the 3rd season, Larry and Balki have now moved to a new apartment, with Balki getting his own room instead of sleeping on a pullout. And this is when you probably are more familiar with Perfect Strangers and the premise and everything. In the 3rd season, it's, finding its groove. Larry is now a reporter for the Chicago Chronicle, and Balki works in the mailroom. And even the intro is changed to represent this, which I'll get to in a sec. The 3rd and 4th season is notable as we get introduced to a new character, and a very significant one, named Harriet Winslow, and she's an elevator operator in the building. She has a husband, Carl Winslow, and the two of them move into the same apartment in the 4th season, and we'll get to a bit more of that in a second. In the 3rd season, there was also another time slot change. Just to point out, this time halfway through the season in March 1988, they moved Perfect Strangers from Wednesday to Friday. So this was interesting because it was already a hit on Wednesday night, but ABC had some good foresight and the idea of lumping a bunch of very similar and very popular shows all together. Perfect Strangers would now go on Friday night at 8 p.m. ahead of Full House, and this 1-hour comedy block would help to create the iconic TGIF Friday night lineup, which would become absolute must-see viewing, again, depending on your age and where you grew up. This whole thing started with that hour block and moved into a night of marathon viewing, and you did not want to risk missing TGIF. That's how important this Friday night thing was. By its 7th season, Perfect Strangers would be moved to Saturday nights, which is absolute bizarre, and usually is the death of any sort of TV show. There's no sitcoms on Saturday nights. The idea here was to try and spread the youth audience out over 2 consecutive days. They wanted to take over the entire weekend. And like I said, Saturday nights is usually the kiss of death for a show, but it was a big night for adult-based sitcoms, and it was thought that moving Perfect Strangers there would help. It didn't. I don't know if you remember this, it was called I Love Saturday Night, and it was the companion to TGIF. Perfect Strangers would air with shows like Growing Pains and Who's the Boss, but it killed their ratings. They would actually move Perfect Strangers back to Friday night for the 8th and final season, which would only be 6 episodes. So here's a little more on, trying to completely capture all of the youth market, through TGIF and then trying to take over Saturday nights. They started to do this in seasons 5 and 6. And I honestly did not remember Perfect Strangers lasted for 8 seasons. I don't think I was probably watching as much by the end there. But they made some really big changes going into the 5th and 6th season. Like the Brady Bunch did with Cousin Oliver, if you remember that, Perfect Strangers would add a kid to the start of the 6th season. A new kid named Tess Holland, played by Allison Porter. She was in Parenthood. She was also in Curly Sue. She would become the new upstairs neighbor. Again, the idea behind this was to attract a younger audience with the addition of a new young character. ABC knew how important the emerging youth pre-teen demographic was becoming, and the hope was this could attract the same viewers that were watching shows like Full House. Again, as they go, TGF becoming this like juggernaut of a night that was geared around youth and preteens. So Perfect Strangers is already a great family show, but the other idea of adding a kid is that it would help to seamlessly merge it into that new TGIF lineup. Again, this was a big experiment. They didn't know how it was going to work or if it would work. It obviously did, though. But the idea with the kid in the show never caught on. Porter was supposed to be on full time, but only appeared in a few episodes. They then dropped her out of nowhere and without any explanation why. Kind of like Judy Winslow. Remember her on Family Matters, where she went up the stairs at the end of one season? We just really never saw her again. So that actually leads perfectly into how Perfect Strangers helped launch Family Matters. This was the other big change in the 5th and 6th season, was Harriet Winslow leaving for the spinoff called Family Matters that, of course, you know and love too. She had been on the show for 2 seasons at this point, and she and her husband Carl were very well established. Family Matters is, again, another monster hit for ABC, and that would ultimately become the cornerstone of the TGIF lineup. By the time Steve Urkel joined the show, Family Matters became a pop culture phenomenon and would last for more seasons than Perfect Strangers did. We would never see Harriet on Perfect Strangers again, but there would be some crossover between the two shows. In one of the first episodes of Family Matters, Harriet explains how she had been fired from her job as an elevator operator, but then became chief of security at the Chicago Chronicle. So, you know, every sort of entity has its own universes, and I bet you didn't know there was an ABC universe, not unlike the MCU. There's even a crossover between Full House, Family Matters Step by Step, Step by Step Full House, and Hanging with Mr. Cooper and Full House. They're all connected in some way, and there is crossover performances. So with all the amazing things associated with Perfect Strangers, here's a few more reasons why I think it really was the perfect 80s sitcom. And I'll put it up against Family Ties, which I think was always sort of the number one standard in family sitcoms, but I think Perfect Strangers maybe edges it out. Either way, they're both close. So the first thing is it had the perfect theme song, which you heard at the beginning of the show. Nothing's Gonna Stop Me Now was a standout song amongst many amazing theme songs of the 80s. It's my personal favorite, and I always thought it had this very uplifting feel to it. Maybe you felt that too, or you're reminded of that feeling. It fits in perfectly with this era of 80s sitcoms because it was written by the same people who gave us the themes for Full House, Step by Step, and Family Matters. All those theme songs are sort of like blend pretty seamlessly together. Again, that really helped with setting the same tone for the TGIF lineup. The writers were Jesse Frederick and Bennett Salvi, and it was performed by David Pomerantz. Pomerantz used to open for big acts like Rod Stewart, Billy Joel, even open for The Doors. He also wrote songs for John Denver and wrote It's Every One of Us, which is from my favorite Christmas special ever, The Muppet Family Christmas. The theme song also plays into the changing opening credits, which I mentioned earlier. Of course, they changed over the course of the series. The first 2 seasons featured the full 90-second version of Nothing's Gonna Stop Me Now. And the intro had shots of Larry leaving his family and Balki leaving Mipos on a horse cart, if you remember that. It also has the classic shot of the 2 main characters' images sliding together to meet in the middle of the screen, that classic, 80s sitcom trope. If you want to see more and like the links to the video and the opening credits, if you go to everything80spodcast.com/perfect strangers, that's the show notes and the whole blog for this episode. For seasons 3 to 8, the theme song was cut down to 72 seconds, and we have the intro you probably remember best, and it starts with Larry and Balki on the back of that tour boat on the Chicago River. We now see them around Chicago, including scenes in front of Wrigley Field and other notable Chicago landmarks. So the next reason this is a perfect sitcom, it had perfect casting and perfect characters. And, we mentioned how great the chemistry was between Lynn Baker and Pinchot, and you can definitely see that on the screen. Again, it used that classic odd couple buddy sitcom sort of thing that we've seen in so many other classic TV shows. A good nod to this is when Larry and Balki come up from the subway in the opening credits, and you actually see the Odd Couple is playing on the Chicago theater. So that's them giving their tribute to what influenced their show. Where a lot of other shows in the 80s were all issue focused, Perfect Strangers was all about the characters, the humor, and the situations. And that's what, again, makes it a true situational comedy. These characters are also very relatable, and many felt that Balki was like their own cousin. There was both of them were like the perfect yin and yang, with Balki being happy-go-lucky matched against the neuroticism of Larry. It also made it easy for the series to function, as you got to rely on a duo and not just one person who's forced to carry the show. It's been noted as having the same dynamic as, probably the classic blueprint for a sitcom in The Honeymooners. And when you had that dynamic of Ed Norton and Ralph Cramden playing off each other between Jackie Gleason and Art Carney, that's where you create true like sitcom magic instead of one person having to be the absolute focal point. And, Larry and Balki were even called the Ed and Ralph of the 1980s. It also captured some of that character-driven humor made famous on, say, like I Love Lucy, another blueprint standard for modern sitcoms and shows. And it made a lot of use of the physical comedy, which is easily appealing to kids. And that will draw them in no matter what. Whether you don't understand the subject matter, you understand the physical humor. Again, another thing that would make Kramer so beloved, and why Seinfeld is such, again, probably the modern version of what perfect television comedy can be, because you have this sort of deep, again, neuroses and focus on cerebral humor without getting too deep. But then it's got the absolute outlandish, just wacky physical comedy of Kramer, and it perfectly combines those two. And that's, I think, what makes that such a standout. Lucille Ball herself was noted as being a fan of Perfect Strangers. She had been watching since early on and said in an interview in the Schenectady Gazette in 1986 that she loved those two guys, and you can't get higher praise than that. The same article makes notes that part of the success of the show was that Pinchot and Lynn Baker were allowed to develop their characters and not be restricted by the writing. They were, good at their own improv comedy and, again, like other forms of acting and stage and screen. And, they were given the leeway, which a lot of other shows aren't, where the characters are restricted and written into a box. And they were able to sort of flesh them out more. And I think that really helped too. Okay, we'll start winding it down here. So that, to me, is why Perfect Strangers was the perfect 80s sitcom. Again, it took a lot of elements from those classic TV shows, had the perfect casting, and ultimately was accessible to a wide audience. It didn't take itself too seriously. It didn't have those very deep, on this very special episodes that you would see on shows like Webster or Different Strokes or Punky Brewster or something like that. It was just about the situations, the situations that the characters found themselves in, the physical humor, and then the act of having to get yourself out of that sticky situation. And that's what I think led to its success. It was always lighthearted, where some of these sitcoms sometimes weren't. Again, like Family Matters went into some really deep issues. Perfect Strangers is just like, screw it, we're not going to go with that. Seinfeld's famous for that no hugging, no learning approach they took, which a lot of shows did. Again, say like Full House has that issue. Perfect Strangers is just like, no, let's just make this lighthearted. Let's make this inoffensive. And it still had charm to it. Again, it helped lead the way to another beloved sitcom in Family Matters, and it helped lead the way for some of the biggest shows of the 80s and 90s. So that's Perfect Strangers. Before I go here, I want to talk about the thing I use called patreon.com, which is a way to support this show. And the fact that the podcast platform is a constantly growing and changing one, which is good. And you're obviously a fan of podcasts if you're listening to this one, and you obviously probably listen to a bunch of others. The problem is the industry's been really taken over by, corporations, companies, celebrities, and giant podcast networks. So it makes it tougher for independently produced shows like this to stand out. So by using patreon.com, which I've talked about before on the show, it's a way for you to support the show, but get bonuses at the same time. So this is, little support starting, as little as like $2 a month. but there are different tiers, and with different support levels come the different rewards. So example as say the Boba Fett level, that comes with the Everything 80s podcast movie review show. So again, that's only for patrons. That's not stuff I put up on this main show. And again, it's just a way, if you're a fan of shows like this, it's just a way to add that support and then obviously get something for it at the same time. So if you want to learn more, just go to patreon.com/80. So patreon.com/80s. If you're listening on whatever it is, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever the description is, there'll also be a link just if you want to check out more. But I appreciate you taking the time to listen to this episode. Again, there's a million podcasts out there, actually more than a million, the last I just checked. So the fact you're listening to this one means a lot. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, again, wherever you're listening to this show. I will be back soon with a new episode. Thank you for listening. Talk to you later.